You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello, welcome to this week's campus podcast, focused upon academic entrepreneurship and the complexities of commercialising research. I'm Miranda Prynne, campus editor, and today I'll be speaking to the CEO of Oxford University Innovation, Mairi Gibbs, and the co-founder of an Imperial College biotech spinout, Andrew Hammond. There's been a lot of chat about UK spin-out companies in the 18 months since the 2023 review by Oxford Vice-Chancellor Irene Tracy and venture capitalist Andrew Williamson, which looked at how to further boost activity and investment. And there are positive signs of their recommendations taking effect. UK spin-outs secured £2.6 billion in funding last year, which was a 38% increase on the previous year. And universities are taking lower stakes in their spin-out companies, which is something deemed important to encourage more private investment. However, it is worth noting that just 10 universities account for more than half of the UK's spin-out activity, with Oxford and Cambridge representing 400 companies between them. Now, the government certainly recognises the potential of spin-outs to turbocharge innovation and growth and answer key policy needs. The autumn budget allocated 40 million of proof of concept funding, so that's very early funding to help founders move their discoveries out of the lab. And it might sound like a big figure, but it's not. As academics writing for Times Higher Education pointed out, it's actually about the same cost as bringing just 2 drug discovery programs from inception to first in-human clinical trials. So it very much falls to universities themselves to back their founders and support these entrepreneurial academics in drumming up the investment they need if they are to see more of these fledgling companies make the big time. And while successful spin-outs can bring big returns on the institutional investments, this is not some sort of panacea or easy answer to the higher education funding crisis. Because as we will hear shortly, the road from lab to the markets is rarely straight. And those academics who do decide to embark on this path should ready themselves to take on challenges they may never foresee. Yet, for those trained in the art of problem solving, this can be a hugely exciting and rewarding process, with the ultimate promise of seeing their work in action. Having worked with academics to help them traverse this tricky terrain for more than 20 years, Mairi Gibbs, now head of the University of Oxford's Technology Transfer Unit, Oxford University Innovation, can offer more insight than most into what is needed for successful commercialisation. So I started by asking her to outline the basic steps from research discovery to selling it as a product. Hi Mairi, great to have you on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here, nice to see you.
Just starting with the basics, for someone wholly new to this, what are the stages an academic would need to go through to move their research from discovery to a commercially viable company?
So in terms of process, it has to begin with the academic. We can't make them do it. They have to be curious to think about not just the basic research that they're doing, but how can that be applied? Where might it find a use? Who's going to find it interesting and useful enough to be willing to invest in it, to develop it and to pay to use it? So that's starting to think about market fit. And of course, we help with that. So in terms of process, there's a period of evaluating what's happened in the academic work and thinking about how best to protect that in terms of intellectual property rights, which might be patenting, it might be copyright, for example, in software, or things like health outcomes questionnaires are typically copyright protected only, or increasingly data rights, that sort of thing. So a process of thinking about how you protect what you've got so that you've got a commercially viable asset there, and then thinking about who can we partner with. Does this fit into an existing market where we might already find a partner? And an example of that in Oxford might be the COVID vaccine or our malaria vaccine, which is licensed to Serum Institute of India. So an existing partner who's already out there in the world that's really well positioned to take that basic technology from the university and turn it into a product. Or we might need to create that vehicle ourselves, and we call that a spin-out company. And examples there would be our company Organox, which is pretty well advanced now, and they have a device for liver transplant, which protects and preserves the organs ahead of transplant so that the surgeons can schedule an operation and be really confident in the quality of the liver before it's transplanted. And that's in use in the NHS and in Europe and America. So there wasn't an existing market for a liver perfusion device. The state of the art was you keep livers on ice and you use them as quickly as possible. So a company was needed in order to be able to develop that technology and prove the market need through clinical trials and so on. So we can license is one route. We can create a spin-out company, which is another pathway, but still involves partnering with the commercial world to develop and ultimately exploit that intellectual property. A core part of the role that we fulfill in a technology transfer office is to join that academic culture of basic research with a commercial world of using research for commercial benefit. We should also talk about expertise, and of course academics are able to use their expertise to create impact, whether that's through policy advice, which is a pathway that's very common in the humanities and social sciences, or whether it's maybe technical advisory work for scientific advisory boards or expert witness type work. And OUI is able to help academics with their consultancy and services work, as well as the intellectual property side of things.
On your point that academics can, if they've created a product, found a solution to a particular thing, can obviously partner with an existing company or indeed create a spin out. But either way, I guess investment is needed in this, whatever guise it comes in. So I just wondered what, in your experience, are investors looking for?
Well, investors are there to make more money, whether that's for the benefit of shareholders if you're in a company structure, or for the financial returns for the people that invested in your fund if it's more of a venture capital type environment. So in order to be able to do that, they've got to be able to understand the size of the opportunity. What's the market? How big is it? Is it growing? What's the addressable share of market within that? And then they're looking to manage their risk, because of course they could earn a few % of interest just by putting it in the bank. But instead, you're asking them to put their good and valuable capital to work on a very high risk proposition, which may or may not ever succeed. So the benefit that they can see at the end of that development and commercialisation journey really has to be big enough to merit the risk. And so they will be looking for ways to carefully manage that risk, and things like having a great team, having a well-developed commercial plan, and a business model that makes sense for the marketplace that you're trying to get into, having great people to be able to deliver it, having a credible plan for how much money you need and where that money's going to come from and how you're going to spend it. All of these things help to de-risk that opportunity in the eyes of investors. And conversely, the lack of those things increases risk. And one thing that we often find ourselves needing to do is to work with the researchers to find proof of concept funding, to take those first few steps away from academic research, whether it be to do lifetime study or build a demonstrator or a new cell line study or user-friendly front end for some software. That sort of first steps towards making something look a bit more like an investable proposition is often necessary to help bridge that gap between that basic university research and something that starts to look investable.
Yeah, of course. And have you noticed any changes in the nature of investors in the last, say, 10 years? I mean, I'm aware that there's more of a focus on things like ethical investment, but also potentially money at the moment is more scarce. I don't know if there are any trends that you can point to, good and bad.
Investor sentiment does vary with global economic conditions, and right now at the high value end of the scale, it's really very difficult for companies to do new listings on the stock markets, and there's not so much merger and acquisition type work going on. So all the companies down the food chain haven't got a next step that they can go on to. And of course, that plays down into the world of seed capital that we operate in as well. So economic conditions do make a difference to investor sentiment. If the risk is high, they're more likely to hold on to their capital. But there will always be investors that want to put their money to work. And so then there's a competition dynamic perhaps that plays. When loads of investors are wanting to invest, then the bar lowers for everybody, and they might be more willing to take a risk on a team where there's a few gaps in their plan, where in harder times they're more likely to need a really cast iron, well thought through plan with all of the elements really well evidenced, with the team in place, with some evidence of market traction. So the bar that's needed for investability does go up and down depending on market conditions.
Yes, yeah. I mean, Oxford and Cambridge are way ahead of other UK universities in terms of certainly spinout companies and just the numbers produced each year. Why do you think this is? And are there perhaps some lessons for others across UK higher education?
Yeah, I don't want to put Oxford and Cambridge on a pedestal, because there's really extraordinary work going on with my colleagues in many other universities. I think you need to remember that the research income that underpins the endeavour is very different across the UK's universities. Oxford's research income is sizably greater than many other universities. So you should expect us to be operating at a larger scale because we've got greater inputs. And I think scale does play into success, because these are difficult things to do. A relatively small proportion of the overall research endeavour is going to be capable of trying to form a spin-out company. And of the ones that try, only some will succeed. And of the ones that succeed in raising seed capital, not all of them will succeed in growing all the way through. So it is a really high risk thing. And the legal and commercial aspects of it are also quite complicated. And if you only see a scale that means you've got, one or two opportunities coming up over 3 years, the pace of learning about how you deal with these things is quite slow, and that's quite challenging for my colleagues in some smaller institutions. So I think scale does help, because we see enough volume to be able to have a reasonable feel for market sentiment, to be able to learn from things that go well and things that don't go so well, to be able to train our people internally. And we do see other universities starting to aggregate together. So, for example, some of the universities in the north have aggregated together to form Northern Gritstone, which is their equivalent of our Oxford Science Enterprises, an investment vehicle to help those universities raise their seed capital. In the Midlands, they're raising Midlands Mindforge. So we are starting to see universities work together in order to get that element of scale. In the southwest as well, the Set Squared group of universities are also doing fantastic things. So universities are thinking really carefully about how they do this and are innovating and working together in order to get that scale that you need.
Yeah, that's great to hear, particularly given the undoubtedly incredibly challenging financial conditions that universities across the UK are facing at the moment. You've been talking about scale as key to just the level of resource you can put into this and the kind of expertise that an institution is likely to build. What are the main barriers to commercialisation of research discoveries? I mean, does it just all come down to funding?
It's partly funding, but funding's only one of the components that are needed. You have to have the people. You have to have researchers that are willing and interested to commit to doing this alongside their already significant academic commitments of teaching and research. You need space for those businesses to grow into across the whole pipeline of teeny tiny companies turning into small companies, turning into slightly bigger companies, turning into big companies. And the little ones have very different needs in terms of space than a large company. They won't be able to commit to a 5-year lease, for example. So people, money, space is all really important.
I read a piece recently by a group of founders saying that, well, more government funding was needed, but also a greater appetite for risk to accelerate UK spinout activity. What do you think? Is that fair comment?
I think this government and the previous government had a really clear focus on universities as the seedbed for the UK's next generations of growth companies, growth industry. Of course, looking back over the decades, we've had a repositioning in the UK, as so many countries, away from heavy industry. And, we're still finding our way into what those new industries are going to be. But this government and the last government really want to support universities and challenge us to step up and do our part for the growth of the UK's economy. And we take that really seriously. I think the government supports through higher education innovation funding, which underpins roles in many institutions for the jobs that I and my colleagues do. They've put some funding recently through Research England into proof of concept, that pre-seed de-risking phase, which is really important. And of course, governments set things like tax policy and visas policy for immigration, which affect the flow of capital and people, which is, those are clearly really important resources for our growing businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about the risk appetite in the UK? Would you say as a country we are more risk averse? I mean, I know people certainly always point to the US as being the sort of gold standard of investment when it comes to startups.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Culturally, I think the UK is perhaps closer to Europe than to America. And I think we don't in the UK so much have the culture of failure being a really acceptable part of a learning journey. If you're an entrepreneur, you should succeed. And of course, entrepreneurship is often about failure before you succeed. So there are some cultural things there, but I wouldn't profess to be an expert on the psychological differences between the people of the UK and the US.
No, fair enough. And it might be quite deep water to wade into.
And it would be deep water to wade into, exactly.
Yeah. I know the University of Edinburgh recently established a career pathway that actually elevates innovation alongside research. And I wondered if you felt that current academic career incentives could perhaps do with a rethink in order to advance or place a greater focus on innovation and commercial thinking. Where do you stand on this?
I mean, I think it's really important. Since 2014, the Research Excellence Framework which is the government's 7-yearly audit of research-intensive institutions, it's had impact as a key part of the scoring criteria. So from government, we've been seeing actually that impact and pathways to impact are really important. And that's the view from government. And that does play into academic career success in every institution. So I think incentives, of course, work on academics just as they do on everybody else. Universities all have some form of equity sharing and revenue sharing policies which provide direct financial incentives for academics to get involved in these programs. And there's plenty of evidence from US institutions that building it directly into careers frameworks is a successful thing to do and does help to recognise those academics that get involved.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. It's very easy to think of impact as being policy impact and things related to sort of social justice work. And of course, actually, some of the greatest impact you're ever going to have is by commercialising and spinning out your research into things that are immediately and broadly accessible.
That's exactly right. At OUI, we've spent a lot of time and effort trying to develop our reporting about impact so that we can really evidence that. So we've surveyed our spin-out companies over the last couple of years. So I can tell you, for example, that across our portfolio of 230 live companies, we had responses from about a third of them. And in those companies, 90% of them are working towards at least one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And between the whole portfolio, there are multiple companies working on every single one of those Sustainable Development Goals. So it really demonstrates the breadth of determination to make a real difference to the world's problems.
Yeah, and to credit academics, generally people don't go into that line of work wanting to cause damage.
Exactly. There's a real commitment to using that knowledge to improve things, whatever those things are.
Yeah.
The academic curiosity that leads to discovery research can also be applied to understanding how supply chains work and how this particular technology is applied in healthcare, or how you can build the next generation of more efficient solar cells, to take our company Oxford PV as an example.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You wrote an excellent piece for Times Higher Education last year, arguing that universities and investors needed to do more to support women-led spinouts. Now, I think in the piece it even pointed to figures from the consultancy Bohurst that showed that less than 8% of UK university spinouts had all women founding teams in 2023, while more than 75% were all male. And yet, the revenues generated by women-led startups at that time were shown to be 10% higher than those led by men. So on this basis, why aren't we seeing women's enterprises attract the same level of investment? What is going on here?
It's a really gnarly question, isn't it? And of course, universities have differing levels of diversity in the base population of researchers. It varies by seniority in the university and by discipline as well, as you might expect. So one part of the question is about the women coming into universities at the very earliest stages from school, and making sure that our women are able to access the full range of opportunities that men do. We've got a programme running within Oxford called IDEA, which is increasing diversity in enterprising activities. See what we did there? That's been aiming to promote and foster and encourage women in entrepreneurship. And it really makes a difference just to talk about this. We have a wonderful academic champion leading, Professor Kylie Vincent first, and now Professor Dame Molly Stevens. And that visibility and that academic champion, coupled with networking and some mentoring programs and that sort of thing, has really made a difference in Oxford. And now, over the last 5 years, 39% of our spinouts have at least one female founder, which is progress. It's not where we want to get to, but it's progress. And at least we're now tracking the data so that we can see that we're making progress. But you know from that published investment data that unfortunately our female founders are quite likely to have a harder time when they go out into the wide world of capital to try and raise funds. And I think it comes back to perception of risk. There are many VC firms who are genuinely trying to increase diversity and to focus on diverse founding teams for really excellent reasons, and all hats off to them. But when companies come in front of an investment committee and they're trying to pitch, that investment committee is more likely than not to be significantly male in its composition. And unconscious bias is a real risk. And when you're trying to make an investment decision about something that is risky, is this something that I can understand? Are these people that I can trust? Some of those unconscious biases, I think, do make a difference in that environment, set in the context of how risky an endeavour it is that you're about to deploy your capital into in the first place. So these also are really tricky things to talk about, aren't they? But I do believe that by talking about them, we start to open the windows a little bit and shed some light in. I think there's also something about the way that women can present themselves. We have the story about an entrepreneur. If you were to imagine that, you would be probably more likely to think of the big name white men. If we be brutally honest about it, those are the names that would come to mind. And when investors are wanting to make a high risk investment decision, they need to be able to see that very large pot of gold. And somebody said to me once, I'd rather see you aiming for New York and come back having got halfway there than to give me a really solid, reliable plan for getting to Milton Keynes, but no further than Milton Keynes. And I think often women are much more likely to give a really solidly well thought out plan that they know they can absolutely deliver on, but not quite go out there with the level of self-confidence and self-belief to really shoot for the big prize, which is often what investors are looking for. So, there's multiple factors here. And of course, it's always about the team. And that's where women perhaps have some strengths in building great teams around them and recognizing the skill sets that they do need in order to succeed.
Yeah, so unpicking it and trying to get to the bottom of what might be driving this imbalance is the first stage towards addressing something. I'm sure there are multiple factors, but your point of the investment panels themselves being probably largely male, there's plenty of research to show that however hard humans fight this, and unconscious bias training and all sorts of other things will help, that we do have a natural inclination as humans to trust those that we see as being quite like us. So it makes sense. But it sounds like you've made great progress on it.
Yes, we're working hard on it.
That's all we've got time for today, but thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Anyone listening who is interested in commercialising their work will have lots of useful takeaways.
Pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much, Miranda.
That's a really instructive conversation for any academic considering a commercial route, whether by partnering with an existing company or setting up their own. And it really highlights how worthwhile it can be to just contact your institution's technology transfer team and seek advice very early on. Just find out if this path might be one that is open to you. Alongside this, I really wanted to get the inside story from an academic who has recently been on and is still on their own entrepreneurial journey. So I contacted Andrew Hammond, who is a co-founder of Biocentis. That's an Imperial College London spinout, which is developing gene drive technology as a way to control harmful insect populations. Andrew's background is in molecular biology, and he spent a decade as an early career researcher at Imperial College and later Johns Hopkins University, studying gene drives and using cutting-edge genetic editing tools to modify the mosquito genome. This ultimately led to the founding of Biocentis in 2022, as you will hear, where Andrew now works full-time as head of R&D. Hi Andrew, welcome to the Campus Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastically well. Thank you for having me.
So you are one of the founders of Biocentis, an Imperial College spinout, which emerged from research into gene drive technologies, which, if I understand it correctly, are genetic adaptations that can be introduced into the genome of, in this instance, harmful insects to then modify the population more widely and reduce potential damage, whether that's disease spread or crop destruction and other potential impacts. So that's a very brief summary from me, but perhaps you can fill in the details of how your academic career led to this enterprise.
So how things started sort of goes back quite a long time. I would say it goes back to 15 years before I got into research. There was this incredible idea put out there called gene drive, and the idea was that you could release a few genetically modified insects and they could spread that modification to an entire population and potentially to an entire species to do some good things. And the idea was around, could you eliminate malaria by releasing mosquitoes that either can't transmit malaria or are designed to suppress? So designed to spread a modification that reduces the number of those dangerous mosquitoes in the wild without affecting the others that are unable to transmit disease. So the idea was really powerful, and a lot of people have been working on this for more than a decade before I started. But I'd heard about it. I thought it was incredibly exciting. And in some ways, I'm a bit lazy, and I wanted to do the easiest thing possible to make a massive impact on the world. And I thought this sounds great. So I joined a lab that had been pioneering in the field of gene drive research, but they hadn't quite got the key to make a system that could work in the real world. So we knew that it could work. We didn't know it could work in the real world. And the time that I joined was very lucky. I joined right when CRISPR technology was being developed, and we realized that was the key. So very quickly, I, together with my colleagues at Imperial College, we managed to build the first gene drive that was designed to spread through a malaria mosquito and crash them. And that work was quite successful. It was the first one that ever managed to spread, but it did eventually fail. But it was huge news, and it brought us a lot of publicity, and it brought us a lot of funding. And the Gates Foundation invested very heavily in it, and it became a big organization called Target Malaria that's now a not-for-profit consortium trying to take that forward as a potentially groundbreaking solution for malaria control. So I carried on working on that project for a few years more, and we got it to the point where it worked every time we tested it in a laboratory setting, and every time we tested it, even in a setting that looked a bit more like nature, but was still contained. And it was at that point that I realized for myself, as someone who's good at developing these technologies, that I think the next steps for that are more around regulation, more around policy and decision making. And the project grew to a huge project with probably more than 150 people and more than 150 million in funding. And I thought that my place was sort of onto the next adventure. And that's kind of the beginnings of Biocentis. It's a long introduction.
No, that's fantastic. It's really useful background. You mentioned CRISPR technologies. This is the very targeted gene editing technology, which the two women that developed this won a Nobel Prize. Is that what you're referring to there?
Yes, so Emmanuelle Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna won the Nobel Prize for this recently, and it has completely changed the way that biological research is done. The whole of biotechnology is not what it was over 10 years ago. And that's simply because of this one incredible technology called CRISPR, which has sort of birthed thousands of descendant technologies. And what it is it's a protein and a piece of RNA that together allow you to cut DNA and edit it. And we were able to do similar things before CRISPR, but it might take a team of 15 people working for 5 years to develop one way of cutting one piece of DNA. And nowadays we can get some students in the lab, and within a week they could have developed more than 100 of these pretty easily. So it's democratized genome engineering.
Wow, yeah.
It's a paradigm shift.
It is a paradigm shift. So you mentioned that this previous project you were involved with, focused on malaria specifically, had sort of grown and developed, and really you thought, right, time for me with the skills I've got to move on. Biocentis, as we've already mentioned, is focused on insects and modifying insect populations. But how did, I guess, the focus of Biocentis and the research that it is based on come into play? And I'm interested, when you identified that the work you were doing could be commercialized, when did that first occur to you?
So I have to be a bit honest here, is that I was quite lucky in the chips falling in the right way. So part of the work that we done, it raised this publicity, and we were actually approached by a wealthy Italian investor called Teodoro D'Ambrosio, and he asked the question, is this something that we could take forwards? And separately from this, I'd actually been attending some of the classes that Imperial had on offer for how to start a company, and I had it in my mind that perhaps we could take these technologies and bring them forwards and have a solution that could be extended to other insects that cause problems in the world. And he'd thought the same thing. And this sort of all crystallized around the same time. So from my perspective, we had this incredible technology, gene drive. One of the problems with commercialization is that if you have a technology that can spread from a point that you release it and spread beyond geographical boundaries, potentially from one country to another, it's very difficult to imagine how you might regulate a technology like that. So, who makes the decision? If you want to release it in Burkina Faso, does Uganda get a say? So these are very complicated questions to answer, and this is part of what Target Malaria needs to deal with now. But the other issue was, how do you sell a technology that spreads on its own, that's entirely self-sustaining? And if you want to commercialize this to control insects that are destroying crops, so there are, 25% of all of our crops are destroyed by harmful insects, and it tends to be just a few insects that cause the majority of the damage. So you could use a technology like gene drive to specifically target those very harmful pests without impacting upon the others that are not causing a problem, reduce the insecticides that you need to spray, and reduce the environmental impact that you're having. So all of this was exciting. The big challenge for us was, is gene drive the right technology, and can we develop alternatives that work for a limited amount of time in a limited space, but then disappear? And it means two things. It means one, you have control over when and where you use the technology, and who gets to regulate it. And two, it's a product. It's something that could be sold and used and reapplied, and you can make continuous decisions on whether to keep using it. So these were some of the big things that went into the original idea of whether this is a technology that could be commercialized, and how to do so.
It's fascinating. It's such a good point. You can develop this amazing technology, but unless you can regulate/control it up to a point, then it's going to be very, very hard to commercialize it, because you can't commoditize something that is just going to run.
And that's why for something like malaria, you can argue that's probably the right thing. Malaria is a disease that's claiming the lives of more than 500,000, mostly children every year, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, in the poorest regions of the world. And we don't have a solution for that at the moment. So the argument to use a technology like gene drive makes sense. If you're controlling an insect which is eating your berries and cherries in California, maybe it's not the right approach to try and eliminate that species, across vast parts of the earth. Maybe it's better to have something more targeted. So that was what we wanted to focus on.
Yeah, of course, and particularly given very complex ecosystems where everything has knock-on effects. I just wonder then, you've pointed to some of the complexities, but what were the steps involved in moving from your research findings or technology that you were developing to commercial application? You've mentioned you were approached, but there must have been a kind of staged process that led to the launch of Biocentis and where it is now.
Yes, there are some things that anyone and everyone who wants to try and commercialize their technology from a scientific academic background in the lab will need to do. And one of the important ones is you need to work out whether you can get the intellectual property. So if you want to build a company, you need to be able to get funding. You need to be able to work out if there's a market for the technology you're developing. You need to seek the intellectual property rights, so patents. And I think those are some of the key things that are the main enablers in getting your technology from the lab to the real world. So in our case, we got some patent protection on some of the innovations that we made around gene drive technology. And that was the founding basis behind Biocentis. So it was two patents. And on the basis of those, we said, we have the intellectual property to secure what we're doing and allow us to work on it. The other side of it is that then becomes attractive to potential investors, because they know that if you're working on the technology, you have the exclusive rights to do so. And there's some sort of magic trick that you have the rights to that others don't. So that was an important part. It's also an important part just to demonstrate that you have a commercial hat on, that you really are thinking about where this can go forwards. In the end, a lot of biotech companies will end up developing new intellectual property and new ideas, and their product might end up being very different from the original IP that they were founded on. And that's a normal process, but it's important to seek that original intellectual property just to get you started.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that it's important to demonstrate you have a commercial hat on, because I suspect for a lot of academics and researchers, that might be where the major challenge lies. It probably doesn't come naturally to everyone whose background is in academia. Is there anything you can offer by way of lessons, or what you learned in the process that might help a fellow researcher who's looking at what they're doing and thinking this has a value?
Tons. So I have lots of friends who have lots of brilliant ideas and ask me whether they should commercialize their idea. And often ask them, have you published it and have you presented it at conferences? And the answer is always yes. And that's usually the first problem because you can't seek patent protection for something that you've already disclosed publicly. There are some exceptions, but by and large, you can't do that. And so if you think that there's something in what you're doing that could be commercialized and that commercialization is the right way to bring it forward to the rest of the world, then think very seriously about what it is, and maybe that you should keep that quiet for the meantime while you develop the idea. It's important to speak to the IP experts early on. So every university that has a strong research focus will have a technology transfer team, and they will have experts who can help you look at your technology and see what could you seek patent protection on, and if maybe that there's a right point in time when you should do that. And you need to balance these things because unfortunately in academic science, publications are a currency. You need to publish your research in order to do well and thrive. And commercializing means getting intellectual property, and patents means probably delaying your publications until you've got the IP sorted. So it is important, I would say, to go and contact the technology transfer office and get their opinion. I think another thing that was quite critical, also in directing the type of research you do to ensure the patents and the IP are really secure, is to get some advice on what the market is and whether the idea you have is something that is great on paper or great in the real world. And I'll give a sort of example of this from my own world, which is you can have something where, in theory, if you release those insects in the wild, it does marvelous, amazing things, but you would need to individually hire thousands of people to separate the male insects from the female insects. So you only release the males because the females could spread disease. So that would be completely implausible and couldn't be used as a product, even though at the point that you release those males, it does a great job. And so that's what I mean when I say operations. Is this something that practically you could actually deliver it in the real world? And if you can't, do you know what the steps are that would be needed to bridge that gap?
That makes sense. And of course, also consideration of who your target market is, because even if something might be open quotes better, close quotes technology or better for sustainability reasons, doesn't necessarily mean people will use it if they are used to, for instance, using a pesticide, which they can get very cheap. Very interesting what you say, that researchers who have something that they may want to patent need to just be wary in terms of how they approach publication and conferences and so on, because there's a real tension there between the academic incentives, academic career incentives, which really push the need for publication and for promotion of your research. So that could sit at odds with the desire to then commercialise. And I guess that is where the technology transfer teams perhaps can advise. Is there anything further in terms of what you think the role of an institution should be in the spin-out journey? Are there certain key points where universities need to offer support and help?
If I were to look back at things that I sort of, wish I was given a bit more information about, I think it would have been what the journey looks like. So spelling out quite clearly to people at the beginning of their research careers and even at various points through it, how do you find out when something is the right time to commercialize? What is it you can and can't patent? How do you define what a market is? And if you can't do it, who do you go to help with these things? And again, I think in my case, thinking about the market was always a tough one because things that you've already brought up is that in the EU we don't tend to be too pro GM. So a product like a genetically modified insect might be quite tough to get through the European regulatory system, whereas in the US or in South America it might be. And then in China it's not possible to get patent protection on a genetically modified organism. And so all of these things are things that you couldn't possibly know when you start the journey. But I think if you were given, you can't know everything and you can't tell everybody everything. But I think that you could give an idea on what are the types of problems that people will have in developing a technology from idea to spin out, and the things that you're going to be asked by investors. And one of the scary experiences I had was very early on, we needed to seek additional funding. We had an entrepreneur who helped found the company and give us an initial seed funding, and then we had to go on our own and find new funding. And you get asked questions about things that are so far away from what you ever thought about in the lab. Um, and I think that those questions tend to be the same no matter what your company is. And I think that the technology transfer officers could quite easily challenge anyone who's interested in these things with those questions early on, to give them a good idea of what to think about over the years that they're doing their research to give them time to prepare.
Yeah, on Biocenter specifically, it seems to have involved the collaboration of a really wide variety of experts from well beyond academia. I mean, looking at your founding team, it includes a seasoned entrepreneur, a management consultant, finance expert. So it really crosses sector boundaries and indeed national boundaries. And I just wonder, how did this team coalesce?
That's a great question. So the thing I'm most proud of and happy of is the incredible team that we have. And it really is incredible. And it's the reason why we've managed to build a successful company. Yeah, all of us have our skills and our limits. And we knew that with a challenge like the one that we have, we need a really diverse team of experts. So the entrepreneur who was instrumental in bringing together the company, he sought out those from the consultancy and finance background, and said it's very important that whatever technology you have, what the market is, how to bring it to the real world, how to sell this to investors, how to sell it to the end users. And he brought people on board who had experience not in genetically modified insects, but experience in this area. And that was critical because I've learned an awful lot from these people. Giorgio Rocca is the CEO of the company, and he's taught me an awful lot. It's been an incredible journey, and Federico Guelpa, his sort of right-hand man, is the head of strategy. But both of them have taught me an awful lot about how to run a business. And then on the other side of things, we realized all these other challenges we would have. So we realized we need to not just build a technology, but we need to be able to convince people that we can make predictions about the real world and make predictions about what the impact could be. How much money are we saving the farmers? And part of that is knowing the market and knowing how much people spend on insecticides and spending a lot of time speaking to the big agrochemical companies, speaking to farmers themselves, doing that real market research. The other side of it is making predictions with mathematical models to say, here's what we think could happen. So we brought on board data scientists who had an incredible background in pure data science, and said, help us make these predictions. And so all of this work required all of our expertise. It required myself and the molecular biology team to explain how the technology works, and the limitations of it. It required the data scientists to put together mathematical models that can make predictions. It required the people with a consultancy background and finance background to work out what would be the benefit to farmers and growers who use the technology, or to public health. Yeah, it's a huge venture that we have, but I think that these are not unique to Biocentis. I think that every company needs to bring together really the top people in the different sectors. And we have a new exciting technology. Our technology has the potential to be orders of magnitude more effective. And that was the thing that attracted all these people from these various backgrounds to come together, because we said, this is really exciting. This could change the world. This could have a massive impact on how we control insects. It could be good for the environment, reduce carbon dioxide release, pesticide use, reduce disease transmission. So the whole thing was exciting to all of us in terms of the real impact we could have in the world, but also founded on a technology that looks to be incredibly exciting. So I think how we got it together was a great technology and a great founding team that could excite others to join.
Yes, and you've pointed to the fact that if you are going to attempt to commercialize research or new technologies, you've got to expect the unexpected, deal with questions you have never even considered. So having this incredibly broad range of expertise is really the most effective way to handle this need for huge adaptability and kind of real-time problem solving. On the team and the diversity of experts and backgrounds, I did wonder, did you or do you face any challenges in working together with such varied backgrounds? As I imagine, while that brings huge strengths, it could also mean quite different ways of working, different cultural norms and ways of communicating, or even expectations, and how you've handled that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So it's been a it's been a learning curve, yeah, a big learning curve for all of us. We'd all spent a lot of time in our respective fields, and this was our first opportunity to work with people doing, with such a different background, and the way of working is very different. So yeah, the idea of having a scheduled meeting that lasts for precisely 35 minutes and then ends was quite alien to me in the world of academia. Also, if we say that we're going to get something completed in a month and it takes four, that's also not so alien in academia, because you go in the direction that you find most interesting. And that simply doesn't work if you want to build a company, build a product, and convey a sense of you being a responsible adult to the investors who are putting a lot of their money into into believing in the success and the vision. So I've learned a lot about structure. I've learned how to plan my time much better, how to say no to things, which is I always find very difficult. I want to say yes to everything, everyone, and be involved in all the different opportunities. Everything's so exciting that you want to learn all these great things. But what's been important is these people who came from the management consultancy background, they really knew how to structure their time, how to focus, how to get things together. I think they picked up a few things from us, which is we're very good at dealing with uncertainty, and we're very good at saying we'll solve the problem. And so I think we've all sort of relaxed a bit, because we've now known after several years of doing this that there were problems that at the beginning we didn't know how to solve. And I always have this funny confidence of it's fine, we'll work it out. And so far we always have. So I think that we've been meeting halfway on being able to structure every activity from sort of start to end, versus allowing some degree of maneuverability, which I think is quite essential if you're a startup and you need to be quite adaptive and responsive to whatever's happening at any one time. Another interesting one was writing grants, where from my side, it's about scientific salesmanship and talking about the science, how interesting it is, all the things we'll learn. And they took a look and they said, yes, but you haven't sorted out section 4.3.8, which is on the gender dimension. You haven't talked about the differences in the number of males and female insects that you'll be working on. And I thought, well, that's quite silly. I don't think it's super relevant. But you do it and you realize you get scored higher, and you end up winning grants that you might not have won otherwise. So there's a place for having very different ways of looking at things.
Absolutely, I can see that the push and pull between those two approaches, results in a really effective balance. What's next for you, for Biocentis?
Yeah, so the sort of crazy thing about how we started is that we started based on a technology that we thought wouldn't be perfect as it was, and it needed some adapting. And it took us about a year to finally decide upon what the technology would be. And it was the right decision, but it's a painful year, because the whole time that you're still thinking, you're not really developing the final product. So we've now solidified that idea. We've got a couple of patents submitted on the idea, and we've actually managed to build the technology, and it works beautifully well. So having a final product, we're sort of getting there in the next few months. I think we'll have something that really looks like a product, something that we could go to the field. We've been speaking to potential partners in different parts of the world, mostly in the US and South America, who would take on our insects, and they would do some field trials with us. So we're thinking in the next couple of years, we're going to get these technologies out into the real world, partnering with academics to test whether this stuff works as well as we think it will, and moving on to the real commercialization, which is actually selling these things and finding the commercial market, which we already have some ideas on what that will be. But once you have the product demonstrated, you publish it, you show to the world that it really works, that's when things move up a notch. I think A couple of the big challenges over the next couple of years is, get that demonstration out there and publicize it and tell the world exactly what it is we've built. It's work out how to do this at scale. Doing things at a small scale is one thing. Doing it in the scale of millions of insects being produced, you have to start worrying about things like quality control. And we need to dedicate a lot of our time towards the regulatory side of things. So we'll need to build a regulatory dossier and convince people that it's really the right, safe, and effective approach. It's going to be an exciting next few years. Very, very busy, but very fun.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It sounds like you're at a very exciting point. But with that, of course, I'm sure will come plenty of fresh challenges for you to grapple with. Thanks so much for sharing your journey and the many useful lessons for others with us, Andrew. And wishing you all the best. I will watch with interest.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
That was such an enlightening conversation. It just demonstrates in real terms why this stuff is so complicated and can take so many years to realise. I, for one, am very grateful that there are people out there willing to take on these challenges. And I do think spinouts, which often provide life-changing, even world-changing solutions, should be more widely celebrated and praised beyond academic circles. I suspect most people outside of the higher education sector would be quite hard-pressed to name even one spin-out company. They might mention the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID vaccine, which is a great example of a commercial partnership, but that's about it. And I'd argue that needs to change if society is going to really recognise the value of our universities. Right, I'll step down from my soapbox. You can find loads of practical advice and insight on how to commercialise research and work with industry partners on campus, including a recent spotlight guide with contributions from academics all over the world exploring these topics. So you'll find all of that at www.timeshighereducation.com/campus. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe, and we will be back with you in a couple of weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.